At dinner, my wife announced she wanted a divorce. She smiled and my kids cheered. I calmly pushed my plate aside and said, "Fine. But know this, I'm not the biological father of any of you. I chose to stay. But today you helped me choose to leave." And what I did next made them beg me to stop. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. I'm not a man who talks much. I never was. I grew up in a family where words were abundant and actions were scarce. So I learned to do exactly the opposite, to talk little and move a lot, to observe before reacting, to keep whatever it is until it's the right time to use it. That saved me more than once in business, and it turned out it also saved me in my marriage, although in a way I never imagined I'd need. I met Viviana when I was 27. She was 24. She was smart, direct, with an energy that filled rooms. I fell in love with the same speed I made work decisions. Fast, without doubting too much. Today I know that was a mistake. Not falling in love with her, but not stopping to observe her longer before committing my entire life. We got married a year and a half later. By then, I'd already been working for 4 years in a civil engineering company, saving every peso I could, building something from scratch with my hands and head. I didn't come from a family with money. My father was a factory worker his whole life. My mother cleaned other people's houses. What I had, I'd earned myself. Every dollar, every contract, every promotion. When Marco, the oldest, was born, I was 29. Viviana told me he was mine from the first moment, and I believed it. Why wouldn't I believe it? She was my wife. We slept in the same bed, shared the same life. I had no reason to doubt, or so I thought. Then, 2 years later, Andrea arrived, and 3 years later, Araceli. By the time the youngest was born, I was already a partner in a consulting firm, earning well, and we'd bought the house where we'd live for the next 18 years. A big house in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden and a 2-car garage. Everything that's supposed to mean you made it. And I believed it for a long time. I genuinely believed it. I worked nonstop, work trips, long nights, weekends in front of blueprints and contracts. I didn't complain. It was what had to be done. It was the responsibility I'd chosen. I had a family to support, and I took that with a seriousness that, I understand today, nobody in that house ever really valued. Viviana stopped working when Marco was born. A decision we made together, or so I thought. Over time, I understood it was a decision she made, and I accepted without questioning it too much because I was too busy building what she was going to enjoy effortlessly. She stayed home, managed the household, she said, but what she really managed was her free time, her outings, her long conversations with her sister Beatrice, a woman who never looked kindly upon me, and who I simply tolerated for many years because she was part of the package. The kids grew up, and with them grew something I kept ignoring for too long because I didn't want to see it. A distance, a coldness that settled in slowly, so slowly that when I wanted to measure it, it was already huge. Marco started treating me with an indifference that bordered on contempt when he was about 16. Andrea almost always imitated him. Only Araceli maintained something akin to affection, although it was a weird affection, like guilty, as if she wanted to get closer, but something stopped her. I attributed it to adolescence, to kids pulling away, to that's how life is. I repeated it to myself when I got home tired and nobody asked how my day went. I repeated it to myself when it was my birthday and the celebration was a text message and nothing more. I repeated it to myself when I put money on the table and the gratitude was silence. But there's a moment when excuses run out, and that moment came on a Tuesday night exactly 3 years and 4 months ago. I gotten home early, something unusual, because a meeting was canceled at the last minute. I entered through the back door, quietly put my keys down, and heard voices in the living room. Viviana was on the phone. She wasn't yelling. She was speaking softly with that voice people use when they don't want to be heard. I stopped in the hallway and listened. Not everything, just enough for something inside me to break, and at the same time to organize itself, like when a piece that never fits suddenly finds its place. But the place is the worst possible one. I heard man's name. I heard the word documents. I heard Viviana say with a calmness that froze my blood that he'll never know anything until it's too late. She hung up. I stood still in the hallway for almost a minute. Then I went into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and when she appeared, she smiled at me like nothing happened. "You're here." "I didn't hear you. I just got here," I said and smiled back. That night I didn't sleep, but not out of pain, but because I was thinking, calculating, organizing everything I had to do from that moment on. Because if there was something the conversation had made absolutely clear to me, it was that I'd spent years being the only one in this family playing fair, and that was about to change. I didn't tell her anything that night. Not that night, nor the following ones. That's something people don't understand when they hear stories like mine. They assume the moment you discover betrayal is the moment you explode, that you yell, that you confront, that you demand answers. But I'm not that kind of man. I never was, and precisely because of that, what came next worked so well. I stayed quiet. I kept going to work. I kept coming home at the usual time. I kept sitting at that table on Sundays, eating with my family, listening to conversations where nobody asked me anything important. I kept being the background of the painting. The one who pays, the one who doesn't protest, the one who's always there, but nobody really sees. Except now I knew exactly what was happening, and they didn't know I knew. That difference changed everything. The week following the call I heard, I started moving slowly, without noise, without leaving a visible trace. The first thing I did was call Leopoldo. I'd known him for over 15 years. He'd been my firm's lawyer for a decade. A serious, discreet man, with a legal intelligence I always respected. I asked him for a meeting outside his office. Breakfast, I told him, something informal. He accepted without asking questions, because that's how Leopoldo was. He understood when a situation required silence rather than words. We met on a Thursday morning at a cafe neither of us frequented. I told him what I'd heard. Not everything, because I still didn't have everything, but enough for him to understand the direction I needed to move in. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took a sip of his coffee, slowly put the cup down on the table, and told me something I never forgot. "Miguel, the most expensive mistake a man makes in these situations is moving with his heart before moving with his head. You've already chosen well, now don't rush." Those words became my compass for the next 3 years. Because yes, 3 years. That's how long I took. Not out of fear, not out of indecision, but because what I was building required time, precision, and patience. It required every piece to be in its place before moving any of them. It required that when the time came, there was nothing they could do. Absolutely nothing. The first thing I needed to understand was the real scope of what Viviana was planning. Leopoldo recommended someone to me. I won't give names, it's not necessary, who did private investigation with an almost surgical discretion. In less than 6 weeks, I had a picture on my desk that confirmed what I already suspected and revealed things I hadn't even imagined. Viviana had been in close contact for at least 4 years with a man whose name I won't mention here. Not because I care about protecting him, but because he's irrelevant to this story. He wasn't the important thing. The important thing was what she'd been planning with the help of her sister Beatrice. And that was relevant, very relevant. Beatrice, the woman who always smiled at me at family gatherings, who hugged me on Christmas, who called me brother-in-law with a familiarity I never asked for, had been helping Viviana build a case, a fake case. They'd been gathering testimonies, fabricating situations, preparing a narrative where I appeared as an emotionally abusive, controlling man who had psychologically damaged her kids for years. All a lie, all built carefully and over time. The goal was simple and brutal, to present that case in the divorce, to tilt the legal scales completely in her favor. Not just to keep the house, but everything. The house, the savings, a monthly alimony, and to leave me with a destroyed reputation that would prevent me from even defending myself socially. When I read that report, I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I sat in my office, closed the door, and was silent for maybe 20 minutes. Just that, because I needed what I was feeling to pass through me without moving from my spot. I needed to process it and leave it behind. Anger is only useful if you control it. If it controls you, it destroys you before you could do anything. Then I started the second phase. Leopoldo and I worked for months on the legal structure of what was to come. The first and most urgent thing was to protect what I'd built. I'd spent over 2 decades generating wealth. I had stakes in 2 real estate projects, an investment portfolio I'd built with discipline over years, and the family house, valued back then at just over $400,000. None of that could be left exposed. Leopoldo explained precisely what was possible to do within the legal framework. We set up a company, technically a holding, to which I gradually transferred assets, fully documented, completely legitimate. It wasn't overnight. It was a process that took almost 18 months, designed so every move had a clear justification on paper, nothing that could be easily reversed, nothing that could be pointed out as a last-minute maneuver. Meanwhile, at home, everything stayed the same. That's the part that's hardest for me to explain to people, how I could keep living with apparent normality while knowing what I knew. The answer is that I didn't live it as an act. I lived it as a decision. I decided that as long as the process wasn't ready, my behavior wouldn't change at all. I wasn't going to give her signs. I wasn't going to make the mistake of suddenly becoming cold or distant or starting conversations that would put Viviana on alert. She had to keep believing I was the same man as always, the predictable one, the one who doesn't see what's right in front of him. And she believed it. I'm sure of that because the arrogance of someone planning in secret for a long time is that they eventually stop considering that the other person might be doing exactly the same thing. There are difficult moments. I'm not going to lie. There were nights when I watched her eat dinner and thought about everything I knew and had to make a real effort to keep a neutral expression. There were moments when Marco spoke to me with that tone of superiority he'd developed, that tone I now understood where it came from, because nobody despises who raises them. That's taught. And I had to breathe slowly and remind myself it wasn't the time. The time would come, and when it did, I'd be ready. Well, I still didn't know then. What I discovered a few months later, and what would change the entire dimension of this story, was the truth about my kids, or rather, about what Viviana always knew and never told me. That puzzle piece wasn't on my table yet, but it was about to fall. And when it fell, everything I'd built up to that point gained a weight that not even I had anticipated. But that will come later, because some truths need their own time to be told. There are truths that don't look for you. You find them, and you usually find them when you least expect it, in the most ordinary moment, in the most commonplace, as if the universe decided it was enough time carrying other people's lies. It was a Saturday morning. Viviana had gone out early with Beatrice, something that had become routine in recent years. Those long outings from which she returned hours later with shopping bags and a convenient vagueness when you asked her where they'd been. Araceli was still sleeping. Marco and Andrea led their own lives by then. They visited the house on weekends with an irregularity that depended more on whether they needed something than on any other real reason. I was in the study, looking for an old contract I needed to review for a consulting job. I was closing a document from years ago stored in a physical folder because back then I still didn't digitize everything. I started going through the filing cabinet folder by folder with the calm of an unhurried Sunday, and then I found something I wasn't looking for. It was a white envelope with no letterhead stuck between 2 household document folders, as if someone had hurriedly put it there and never went back looking for it, or as if they decided nobody would ever find it there. My name wasn't written on it. There was nothing written, just a sealed envelope, somewhat thick. I held it for a moment. I didn't open it immediately. There was a second, just one, where a part of me considered leaving it where it was, putting it back between the folders, closing the cabinet, keeping looking for my contract. But that part lasted exactly as long as it takes a cowardly thought to dissolve in the face of reality. I opened it. Inside there were 3 printed pages, not handwritten. Test results, dates, names, numbers I didn't fully understand at first because I'm not a doctor or geneticist, but that were enough to make something in my chest tighten in a way I'd never felt before. It took me several minutes to process what I had in my hands. I read each page twice, then a third time. They were paternity tests, all 3, one for each child. And all 3 results said the same thing, with the cold and unadorned clarity scientific documents have when they deliver a truth nobody asked for out loud. Incompatibility, exclusion of biological paternity. In all 3 cases, Marco, Andrea, Araceli, none was biologically mine. I sat in the study armchair. I don't remember deciding to sit. Simply at some point, I stopped standing and was sitting with the 3 pages on my lap, looking out the window toward the garden I designed myself with the trees I planted myself. In the house I'd bought with money I'd earned working for decades for a family that had known a truth for years that had been hidden from me from the beginning. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. I didn't cry that day. What I felt was something different from pain. It was more like clarity, a brutal, almost physical clarity, like when you turn on a light in a room that had been dark too long, and suddenly you see everything that had been there the whole time without you being able to see it. Every distance, every evasive look, every time Marco spoke to me like I was a stranger in my own house. Every time Viviana changed the subject when the conversation got too close to certain years, certain periods, certain names, everything fit, everything, absolutely everything fit. Now, what I still didn't understand was when Viviana had ordered those tests, because someone had requested them. Someone had taken those kids, or their samples, to a lab, paid for that analysis, received those results, and decided to hide them in a white envelope among document folders instead of telling me. That person was her. There was no other possible explanation. I photographed the 3 pages with my phone. I put them back exactly as I found them inside the envelope, between the same folders, in the same position. I closed the filing cabinet, found my contract, and when Viviana arrived that afternoon with her bags and her Saturday smile, I asked her how her day went and listened to her answer without anything on my face revealing what I'd just discovered. That was probably the hardest performance of my life and the most important. I called Leopoldo the following Monday. I sent him the photos before the meeting so he'd arrive prepared. When we met, he looked at me with an expression that for him was the equivalent of dismay, something subtle, barely noticeable, because Leopoldo was a man who'd seen too much in his career to be easily shocked. But that day there was something different in his eyes. "This changes the legal weight of the case," he told me. "Not in the way she'd expect, but in yours." He patiently explained what that information meant within the context of what we were already building. The fact that I'd raised 3 kids who weren't biologically mine for over 2 decades without knowing it, and that there were documents proving Viviana had that information and had deliberately hidden it. That wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a legal element of considerable weight. Depending on how it was handled, it could completely change the divorce narrative she was planning. But there was something else we needed to understand. Since when did Viviana know? When had she ordered those tests? Before or after she started planning the divorce with Beatrice? That required more investigation and more time. Over the following weeks, I lived with that information on me, as if it were a physical weight. Not a weight that crushed me, but one that reminded me at every moment that what I was doing mattered, that I couldn't make a mistake, that every move had to be precise because what was at stake wasn't just money or properties, it was the complete version of the truth. And I was determined for that truth to come out complete, not halfway, not distorted, not filtered by the narrative Viviana and Beatrice had been building for years. The investigator Leopoldo had hired managed to establish an approximate timeline. The paternity tests had been requested just over 7 years ago. Araceli was 11 back then, which meant Viviana had spent 7 years knowing none of the 3 was my biological child. 7 years looking me in the eyes at that table. 7 years letting me work, sacrifice, build, pay, support, knowing what she knew. 7 years choosing silence because silence suited her. There was a night near midnight when Araceli came down to the kitchen and found me sitting there with a cup of cold coffee. She stopped at the door. She looked at me with that expression that had always seemed strange to me in her, that mix of closeness and guilt I'd never known how to read well. She sat across from me without saying anything for a moment. "Are you okay?" she asked me. "Yes," I told her, just thinking. She looked at me a second longer than necessary, and then nodded slowly. She got up, got a glass of water, and went back to her room. But before going out the door, she stopped with her back to me and said something in a very low voice, almost as if talking to herself. "You've always been the only one who was really here." I didn't turn around. I waited for her footsteps to go up the stairs and fade into the hallway. And then, yes, that night, for the first and only time in that whole process, a couple of tears escaped me. Not from pain, but from something I don't really know how to name. Maybe from the confirmation that at least one person in that house was aware of what I'd represented. Even if it was late, even if it didn't change anything I decided anymore, because my decision was made long before that night in the kitchen. It was made from the moment I read those 3 pages in the study. It was made from that Tuesday night in the hallway when I heard Viviana talking softly about documents and about how I'd never know anything. What I was missing was the moment, the exact moment when everything I'd built in silence for 3 years would be set in motion. And that moment, though I didn't know it yet, was going to come from the least expected place. It was going to come from herself, from her own arrogance, from that smile she practiced in front of the mirror before sitting at the table on a Sunday night and announcing, with a certainty that would last her very few minutes, that she wanted a divorce. She thought she was surprising me. She had no idea what I'd spent 3 years preparing for that exact moment. The last months before that Sunday dinner were the most intense of the whole process. Not because anything had changed on the surface. The house stayed the same. The routine stayed the same. Viviana kept going out with Beatrice on Saturdays. Marco and Andrea kept showing up when they needed something. But because beneath that apparent normality, the 2 machines were running at the same time. Hers, which I already knew in quite some detail, and mine, which she didn't suspect at all. Leopoldo and I met every 2 or 3 weeks, always outside his office, always in different places, always with the discretion the situation demanded. By that point, the legal structure we'd built was practically complete. The holding we'd set up already grouped most of the wealth I'd generated during the marriage. The transfers were documented with a solidity Leopoldo described as practically impregnable. Every move had a date, justification, paper backing. Nothing had been done all at once. Nothing could be pointed to as an emergency maneuver. But there was something else Leopoldo wanted to make sure to have before any formal process began. The recordings. I don't mean something illegal. I mean conversations I'd been careful to document for months in my own home, within the framework of what the law allowed in our jurisdiction. Conversations where Viviana, feeling completely safe, had said things no lawyer in the world could defend as innocent. Call fragments. Moments when Beatrice visited the house and the 2 talked in the living room believing I was upstairs or had gone out. Concrete words, concrete dates, concrete intentions expressed out loud by the people who had them. There was one conversation in particular that Leopoldo listened to twice in a row when I showed it to him. Then he looked at me and said with that calmness of his I already knew well, that with that alone, it was enough to completely dismantle the emotional abuse narrative they'd been building. Because in that conversation, Beatrice asked Viviana what specific details they should insist on so the testimony would sound more convincing. And Viviana answered with a precision that left no room for a favorable interpretation. It was fabrication, documented with their own voices. That was the center of what they planned to use against me. And that center had just been completely emptied without them knowing it yet. The wealth was protected. The paternity tests were photographed and in Leopoldo's hands. The recordings were kept in a safe place with copies in 3 different locations. The prenuptial agreement, a document Viviana had signed 23 years ago and which, as Leopoldo confessed to me with a discreet smile, she clearly had never read carefully again. It established conditions that severely limited what she could claim in case of divorce for causes not attributable to me. And given that the causes were completely attributable to her, that document became a piece of considerable weight. Everything was ready. The only thing missing was the detonator. And I decided from the beginning I wasn't going to pull that detonator. I was going to leave it in her hands because the best trap is the one the other person triggers alone, convinced they're winning. Viviana gave it to me on Sunday. I'd spent weeks noticing something different in her, a contained energy, an impatience that slipped out in small gestures. She checked her phone more often, had short conversations she cut off abruptly when I entered the room. She smiled in a way that wasn't for me, but for something she was thinking about. I observed it all without commenting on anything. I knew what it meant. I knew the moment was approaching, and I was ready. That Sunday, I prepared to meet myself, as I always did. I set the table, called everyone to dinner. Marco arrived with that attitude of someone doing a favor. Upon appearing, Andrea sat looking at her phone until I asked her to put it away during the meal, which she did with a sigh she didn't try to hide. Araceli arrived last, sat in silence, and looked at me for a second before lowering her eyes to her plate. Just that second, as if she knew something the others didn't know, or as if she felt something was about to change without being able to name exactly what. We ate for several minutes without anyone saying anything important. Filler conversation, the kind that fills the silence without saying anything real. I was calm, completely calm. Not the way someone is calm when they don't know what's coming, but the way someone is calm when they know exactly what's coming and have decided to receive it standing up. It was when we were finishing the main course. Viviana put her silverware on the table with a small noise that was almost like a signal. She wiped her mouth, looked directly at me, and with that voice she'd practiced, I know because it was too controlled to be spontaneous, she said the words she'd spent months preparing. Miguel, I want a divorce. I already made the decision, and there's nothing to talk about regarding this. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, but in my memory, it has the texture of something much slower. Marco let out a kind of short laugh, almost a snort, and leaned back in a chair with his arms crossed and an expression he didn't try to hide. Andrea smiled. Not a big smile, but a real smile of relief, like someone who hears something that had been pending for a while was finally resolved. Viviana kept her studied expression of calm, although in her eyes there was something I recognized perfectly: satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who believes they just made the first move in a game they already won. None of them looked at me with concern. None waited for my reaction with anything resembling uncertainty. They all acted as if the outcome was already defined and my role at that moment was simply to receive it. And in that instant, while looking at the three of them, at Viviana with her calculated smile, at Marco with his borrowed arrogance, at Andrea with her thoughtless relief, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not anger, not pain, something more like the absolute serenity someone feels when after years of work, they see the last piece fall exactly where it had to fall. I pushed my plate away slowly, took the napkin, wiped my mouth, folded it carefully, and left it on the table, and spoke. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice an inch above my normal tone. I didn't need to. The words that were going to change everything didn't need volume to have weight. They just needed to be said at the exact moment, with the exact calmness by the exact person. Very well, but know one thing. I'm not the biological father of any of you. I chose to stay, and today you helped me choose to leave. The silence that followed was a type I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't the silence of a pause. It was the silence of something breaking without making a sound. Marco stopped smiling in a fraction of a second, as if someone had cut the string holding his expression. Andrea opened her mouth and closed it. Viviana, and this is what I remember most, lost her color, not all at once, but as if it were being taken away slowly, layer by layer, while she processed what she just heard. Only Araceli didn't react with the impact the others did. She lowered her eyes, just that. And in that small gesture, there was something I interpreted as the confirmation of what I already suspected, that somehow she already knew or had intuited it, or someone at some point had dropped something in front of her that the others thought she hadn't heard. I got up from the table. I didn't say anything else that night. It wasn't needed. The words were already in the air, and there was no way to take them back. I went to my study, locked the door, and sat in front of the desk, where 3 years before I'd read those 3 pages that changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. From the other side of the door, I heard voices, first low, then more intense. Marco asking something in a tone that no longer had any arrogance. Viviana answering with an urgency that gave away she was losing control of the situation she herself had created. Andrea crying, I think, although I wasn't sure. And Araceli, nothing. No sound from Araceli. I turned on my computer, wrote a message to Leopoldo. For words, put in motion. And what started that night wasn't the end of something. It was the start of everything that had been waiting for the right moment to exist. That night, I didn't sleep in the room I'd shared with Viviana for 23 years. I slept in the guest room with the door locked in a bed I'd never used, with a calmness that would surprise anyone who didn't understand what it means to reach the end of a decision you've spent years making. It wasn't indifference, it was resolution. There's a huge difference between the two. Even if from the outside they might look the same. At 6 in the morning, I was already awake. I showered, got dressed, made coffee in the kitchen while the house was still sleeping, and sat at the same table where the night before everything had changed. I looked at it for a moment. The tablecloth was slightly wrinkled from when someone had grabbed it tightly. The plates were still unwashed. Everything stopped, like a scene nobody had had the mood to dismantle after the impact. I drank my coffee slowly, then gathered the plates, washed them, cleaned the table, folded the tablecloth. Not because I wanted to erase something, but because that order was mine. It always had been, and it wasn't going to stop being mine because of what happened the night before. At 8:30, my phone rang. It was Leopoldo. "It's already in motion," he told me. "The divorce papers will be formally filed this week from our side. That will take away their advantage of filing them first, which was part of their plan. From this moment on, we set the pace." That was exactly what I needed to hear, because one of the central parts of the strategy we'd designed with Leopoldo was precisely that, not reacting, but getting ahead. Viviana and Beatriz had built their plan, assuming the divorce would be initiated by Viviana on her timeline, with her already prepared narrative and her supposed proof of emotional abuse ready to present. What they didn't consider was that I could move first, that I could file the lawsuit before they finished setting up their pieces. That Monday morning, while Viviana was probably still processing what happened the night before and talking on the phone with Beatriz, trying to reorganize a plan that had already started to crumble, we were already in motion. The first layer of what was to come was discreet and almost invisible to them. Leopoldo filed the initial divorce papers from our side, establishing from the start a completely different narrative than the one Viviana had planned to build. Instead of a surprised and defensive man, the documents presented someone who had documented precisely and for years a series of behaviors, omissions, and deliberate deceptions by his spouse. The difference in legal positioning was huge, and Leopoldo knew it better than anyone. Viviana hired her own lawyer 2 days later. I found out from Leopoldo, who had enough experience to know the main family lawyers in our city well. When he told me the name, I noticed something in his expression that was almost a contained smile. "He's competent," Leopoldo told me, "but it'll take him at least 2 weeks to fully understand what position his client is in, and by the time he understands it, we'll have already established the ground." Those 2 weeks were peculiar. The house became a space of tense and silent coexistence. Viviana and I moved through it like two people sharing a space without sharing anything else. There were no yells, there were no confrontations. She tried to talk to me twice. The first with a tone that still had some of the certainty she'd brought to the table on Sunday. The second with something more like urgency. Both times I listened without interrupting her and told her the same thing. "Everything goes through Leopoldo. I don't have anything else to tell you outside that channel." The second time I said that, I saw something in her look I hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger, it was the beginning of fear, the specific fear of someone who starts to suspect the ground beneath their feet isn't as solid as they thought. Marco called on a Tuesday night. I didn't expect that call, though maybe I should have anticipated it. I answered with the same calmness I'd handled everything else with. "Is what you said true?" he asked, without a greeting, without preamble, directly, with that tone of his that mixed aggressiveness with something that wanted to sound like authority. "Yes," I told him. Silence. "And why didn't you ever say anything?" I took a few seconds to answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to choose my words well. "Because for 24 years, I chose to be your father anyway. And Sunday night, you helped me understand that choice wasn't reciprocal." He hung up. He didn't call again for several days. Andrea didn't call. She sent me a text message saying she needed to process everything and we'd talk when she could. I answered her with 2 words, "Whenever you want." And I didn't insist anymore. It wasn't the time to chase conversations. It was the time to let everyone face what they had set in motion with their behavior. Araceli was different. Araceli was always different. 3 days after the Sunday dinner, she knocked on the door of the guest room, where I was still sleeping. It was almost 11 at night. I opened the door and found her standing in the hallway with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't crying, it wasn't anger, it was something more complex than all that. She looked like someone who spent days carrying something heavy and finally decided she can't keep carrying it alone. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. I gestured for her to come in. She sat on the edge of the bed. I sat in the chair across from her, and then she said something I didn't expect, although maybe somewhere very deep down I did expect it. I knew. Not everything, but something. I heard my mom talking to Aunt Beatrice like 2 years ago. I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough, and I didn't know what to do with it. I looked at her in silence for a moment. "It wasn't your burden," I told her. "It never should have been." Her eyes broke, but she didn't cry. She took a deep breath and looked at me with a directness that curiously reminded me of myself when I was young and had to say something difficult. "Do you hate us?" I didn't hesitate. "No, I never hated you. But love isn't enough when it's completely one-sided, and it took me too long to accept that." She stayed silent a while longer, then got up, stopped at the door, and without fully turning around, said something in a low voice. "What you did for us, even if you aren't our blood father, nobody does that." I didn't answer. I waited for her to close the door and sat in that chair thinking she was right, and that was exactly why what Viviana had done was so serious, because she hadn't betrayed a stranger. She betrayed someone who had chosen, deliberately and completely, to give his life to a family that wasn't his by blood, but that he decided was his by choice. That difference made it all much bigger. Meanwhile, the second layer of the strategy began to activate. Leopoldo informed me that Viviana's lawyer had received the first documents from our side, and that the reaction had been, according to his sources, initial confusion, followed by an urgent meeting with his client. What Viviana's lawyer had found in those documents wasn't what he expected to find. Instead of a man without legal preparation trying to defend himself, he'd found 3 years of meticulous documentation, a well structure that left practically nothing exposed, and a series of evidences pointing directly to the deliberate fabrication of a fake abuse narrative. Viviana and Beatrice's plan had assumed I'd come to the divorce like I'd always come to everything in that house, without knowing what was happening, without being prepared, trusting that the people around me were acting in good faith. She'd assumed it would be easy, that it would be fast, that I'd sign whatever they put in front of me, because I wouldn't have any other option. What she hadn't assumed was that the man who had built a company from scratch, who had closed contracts under adverse conditions, who had learned since he was young that the only way not to be crushed is to anticipate, that man had been watching, listening and building in silence for 3 years exactly for this moment. And that moment was just beginning. The third week after the Sunday dinner was when Viviana understood for the first time in a concrete way that something was very wrong with the plan she and Beatrice had built for years. She didn't tell me directly. By then, we almost didn't talk outside of what was strictly necessary, but I saw it in her in the way she went down the stairs in the morning with a new tension around her eyes, in the way she checked her phone with a frequency that was no longer anticipation, but anxiety, in the way one night I heard her talking to Beatrice with an urgency that had nothing to do with the confidence of previous months. Viviana's lawyer had asked for an exploratory meeting, a standard step in these processes where both parties try to understand the ground before things escalate formally. Leopoldo informed me of the request and explained exactly what it meant. "They want to see what we have before committing to a strategy," he told me. "It's a sign that what they received disconcerted them more than they expected." We accepted. The meeting took place in Leopoldo's office on a Thursday afternoon. I wasn't present. That was a deliberate decision. Leopoldo represented me alone, something that in itself was a message. I didn't need to be there. I didn't need to see Viviana's face when she started to understand. That could wait. What Leopoldo reported to me that night, sitting in the same discreet cafe as always, was enough to confirm the second layer had worked exactly as planned. Viviana's lawyer had arrived with a relatively confident posture. Not entirely, because the initial documents had already shaken him a bit, but still with the expectation there be ground to negotiate from a position of strength. He'd mentioned, with the calculated subtlety lawyers use when they want to threaten without formally threatening, that his client had testimonies and documentation related to the emotional environment of the home during the marriage. Leopoldo had let him finish without interrupting him, without showing any visible reaction. And when the other lawyer finished, Leopoldo opened a folder on the table and slid 3 documents toward him. The first was a partial transcript of one of the recordings. The second was a summary of the private investigator's report with dates, names, and specific details about the deliberate construction of the fake narrative. The third was a legal note describing with surgical precision the implications of presenting fabricated testimonies before court. Leopoldo told me Viviana's lawyer took several minutes to read the 3 documents, that when he looked up there was something different in his expression. Not defeat yet. Lawyers don't reach defeat in a first meeting, but rather the clear recognition that his client's situation was considerably more complicated than he'd been led to believe. The meeting ended without agreements, but with an implicit message that didn't need to be said out loud. The ground wasn't what Viviana had promised it would be. What followed in the next days was something I'd anticipated, but that was anyway interesting to observe from my position. Beatrice started to distance herself. Not dramatically. She wasn't that type of person. She was too calculating to make sudden moves, but with that tactical gradualness people have when they start evaluating if a ship is sinking and when it's convenient to jump. Her visits to the house got spaced out. Her calls with Viviana, which I no longer heard directly, but whose effects I saw in Viviana's mood after each one, started lasting less. Beatrice was starting to protect herself, which made sense, because Beatrice had a lot to lose if the recordings reached a formal legal context. Her voice was in them with a clarity that left no room for denial, and she knew it, even if she still didn't know exactly how much we knew. That uncertainty was part of the design. Leopoldo had explained it to me months before when we were building the strategy. Don't reveal everything at once, he'd told me. Let them imagine what you have. The imagination of someone guilty always exaggerates in the right direction. He was right. The uncertainty about the real scope of what I knew and had documented was doing more damage to Viviana's plan than any direct revelation could have done. Because when you don't know exactly how much the other knows, you start distrusting everything. You start reviewing every conversation, every message, every moment. You start wondering where you failed, what you left exposed, who could have said something. And that internal paranoia does the job by itself. Marco showed up at the house one Saturday. He didn't warn me he'd come. He just arrived, like he always did, with that habit of treating the house as a space he had unconditional access to. I found him in the kitchen when I went down. He looked at me with an expression that was hard to classify. It wasn't the usual arrogance, nor was it regret. Marco wasn't the type of person who reached regret easily. It was something more like evaluation, as if he were recalculating something and hadn't reached a result yet. I need to understand what's going to happen, he told me. With what specifically? I asked him. With everything, with the house, with the money, with what's my mom's share. I looked at him a moment before answering, and at that moment, I understood something about Marco I'd maybe always known, but had never wanted to name so clearly. His concern wasn't his mother. It was the inheritance. It was what he'd assumed for years would belong to him when the time came. He'd celebrated the divorce, not because he wanted his mother's freedom, but because he'd calculated, with the coldness of someone who learned to see relationships in terms of benefit, that divorce suited him. What your mom's share is determined by the legal process, I told him. Talk to her lawyer. But you know more than that. Yes, I admitted. I know quite a bit more than that, but it's not a conversation I'm going to have with you. He stayed in the kitchen a moment longer, as if waiting for me to add something. I didn't add anything. Eventually, he took the keys he'd left on the counter, said something under his breath I couldn't hear well, and left. That afternoon, I reported the conversation to Leopoldo. He listened to me and then asked me a question that seemed important. Does he have access to any joint account with you or Viviana? We checked. There was a household expense account Viviana managed, and to which Marco had been added years ago at a time when Viviana had given him access for emergencies. Leopoldo recommended I act immediately. That same week, through the corresponding legal mechanisms within the divorce process, that account was preemptively frozen. Viviana received the formal notification 2 days later. That was the night I heard Viviana cry for the first time since it all began. Not out of sadness, I'm sure, out of anger, the specific anger of someone who starts to see the plan they thought was perfect has holes everywhere, and every move they make to plug one opens another. But what Viviana and Beatrice still didn't know, what nobody knew yet except Leopoldo and me, was that the most important piece of the whole process wasn't the wealth, or the recordings, or the prenuptial agreement. It was something I'd saved for the exact moment. It would be most effective, something that would change not only the legal outcome, but the complete narrative. Something that would make everything Viviana had built for years collapse not from the outside, but from its own foundations. The paternity tests, I still hadn't formally introduced them into the process. Leopoldo and I had decided from the beginning that that was the element that should appear at the precise moment, not too early because its impact depended on the context in which it was presented, and not too late, because we needed it to be available when the other party believed they still had real chances of winning. That moment was getting closer. I felt it with the same clarity I'd felt 3 years before in that hallway, that something fundamental had changed in my life and I had to choose what to do with it. I'd chosen well then, and I was choosing well now. What would come in the following days would be the part of the process Viviana had anticipated the least, the part where the villains don't lose all at once, but lose layer by layer. And in every layer they believe they can still recover until the moment comes when there's nothing left to recover. That moment was about to arrive. Leopoldo called me on a Monday morning with a voice that had something different. Not urgency. Leopoldo never sounded urgent. It was part of what made him so effective, but a particular concentration like that of someone about to move a piece they've spent a long time waiting to move. It's the moment, he told me. Viviana's lawyer filed his evidence package with the court yesterday. Everything they had, the testimonies, the statements, the complete narrative they built. I took a short pause, and it's exactly what we expected. There's nothing we didn't know. They've already filed everything because they believe that's enough to tilt the case, which means they don't have any reserves left. They've already put all their cards on the table. I immediately understood what that meant. In any legal process, the moment your opponent reveals everything they have convinced they'll win is also the moment they're most exposed, because there are no surprises left on their side. You already know exactly what they're relying on. And if what they're relying on is something you already knew and for which you already have a prepared answer, then that moment of apparent strength is actually the beginning of their downfall. Good. I told him, then it's today. That afternoon, Leopoldo filed with the court what we'd been keeping. Not all at once. That would have been a mistake, a waste of impact, but in a calculated order Leopoldo had designed with the precision of someone who understands that in a legal process the rhythm matters as much as the content. First were the transcribed recordings, authenticated, with date and established legal context. Beatrice's voice asking what specific details they should insist on so the testimony would sound more convincing. Viviana's voice answering with specificity. There was no possible interpretation. There was no alternative context that could change what those words said. It was evidence fabrication documented with the voices of the two people who'd executed it. The effect on the process was immediate. Viviana's lawyer requested a 2-day suspension to review a standard request, but the speed with which he requested it said everything that needed to be said about the internal state of his strategy. Leopoldo called me that night. Her lawyer already knows the emotional abuse case has no future, he told me. The recordings destroy it completely. He's going to try to pivot to another argument. Probably go back to basics. Length of the marriage, contribution to the home, that kind of ground. Safer for him, but much more limited in terms of what he can get for her. And the prenuptial agreement still stands. And on that basic ground, that document is devastating to her. While the legal process advanced with that precision Leopoldo managed better than anyone, something parallel was happening in the closer world. Viviana's social network, the friends, the acquaintances, the people who formed the circle where she'd built her image for years, was starting to receive versions of what was happening. Not because I'd said anything, but because Viviana herself, in her growing desperation, had made the mistake of talking too much with too many people looking for support. The problem with looking for support when you're on the wrong side of a story is that versions travel and transform. And when the full version, including the parts you omitted when telling it, starts circulating, the effect is the opposite of what you were looking for. I found out from an indirect source that in at least 2 conversations, Viviana had tried to present herself as the victim of a cold and calculating man who'd used legal documents to snatch everything from her, which would have been an effective narrative if it weren't for the fact that several of the people she told it to knew enough about our life to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about who'd supported the home for 23 years, about who'd paid for the schools, the trips, the medical expenses, about who'd been present at every important moment while the other was busy. The victim narrative started to crack before Viviana could stabilize it. Beatrice, meanwhile, had made a decision that was predictable, but that nonetheless had concrete consequences. She detached herself. Not publicly. She wasn't that clumsy, but practically. She stopped answering Viviana's calls with the same frequency, canceled 2 meetings they'd planned, and according to what the investigator could establish, discreetly consulted with her own lawyer, which confirmed she was already thinking of protecting herself individually from the recording's implications. That was a blow to Viviana that I didn't have to execute. Beatrice executed it herself with her own cowardice at the moment it would cost her sister the most. It was during that week when we introduced the second piece, the paternity tests. Leopoldo filed them with a meticulous legal context, not as an element of emotional attack. That would have been a tactical mistake, but as part of establishing the objective facts of the marriage. The fact that I'd raised 3 kids who weren't biologically mine for over 2 decades, that there were documents proving Viviana had had that information for at least 7 years, and that information had been deliberately hidden, had direct legal implications on the nature of the marriage and on the moral and legal weight of the claims she was making. The court received it, and Viviana's lawyer, who was already trying to rebuild a strategy on increasingly unstable ground, suddenly found himself with a dimension of the case nobody on his team had anticipated, because Viviana had never told him those tests existed. That was what Leopoldo explained to me with a calmness that couldn't completely hide a very well-controlled professional satisfaction. Viviana hadn't told her own lawyer about the paternity tests, probably because she assumed I'd never find them, or that if I found them I wouldn't be able to use them, or simply because taking that information to her own legal team meant opening a conversation she didn't want to have. The result was that her lawyer had built a defense on ground that had a fundamental crack he didn't know existed. And when that crack appeared in the process, the structure he'd built on top of it lost solidity almost immediately. That night, alone somewhere in the house we still shared, but which was no longer our home in any way, Viviana understood something perfect plans never contemplate, that the person you underestimated for years was watching, listening, and building exactly while you thought you were winning. Marco called again, this time with a completely different tone from the last time. The arrogance had almost completely disappeared, replaced by something that in any other circumstance could have seemed like humility, but that I recognized as what it was, last-minute pragmatism. The kind of attitude that appears in people when they understand the ship is sinking and start calculating how to save what they can. Can we talk? He told me. We already talked, I replied. I told you what I had to tell you. This is going to affect everyone, he insisted. Me and Andrea too. Yes, I told him, the decisions people make affect those around them. That's true. In all directions. There was a long silence. There's nothing you can do. I thought about it for a moment. Not out of indecision. That part was already completely resolved, but because I wanted to be honest in what I was going to say. Well, I could do I did for 24 years. I woke up every morning and chose this family, even though it wasn't mine by blood. That was what I could do, and it was enough for a long time. But not anymore. I hung up. I kept looking at the phone for a few seconds, then I left it on the table and went to make myself some dinner. Outside, the night was quiet. Inside, somewhere in that house that would soon stop being mine by my own choice, the plan that 3 years of silence and precision had built was reaching its final phase. Viviana felt it, I was sure. Beatrice knew it. Viviana's lawyer was calculating it. Marco intuited it. The only thing missing was for everyone to understand it completely. And for that, there was one last piece left, the most important one, the one that would close everything with no possibility of appeal, with no room for the alternative narrative, with nowhere to hide. That piece would arrive soon, and when it did, there'd be no way to ignore it. Thursday of the following week was the most important day of the whole process. Not because it was the most dramatic, actually it was one of the quietest, but because it was the day all the pieces I'd been moving for 3 years simultaneously reached their final position and the board was complete. Leopoldo called me at 9 in the morning. The judge reviewed all the material filed this week, he told me. The recordings, the paternity tests, the prenuptial agreement, the complete wealth documentation. There's a preliminary hearing this afternoon. I need you to be present. It was the first time in the whole process that I'd be physically present in the same space as Viviana within a formal legal context. We deliberately avoided that up to that point, not out of fear, but because the strategy required it. But this hearing was different. This hearing was the moment the judge would establish the framework within which everything else would be resolved. And my presence had a weight Leopoldo considered important. I got dressed with the same calmness I'd handled every moment of the last 3 years with. Dark suit, discreet tie, the shoes I wore when I had important business meetings. It wasn't vanity, it was the understanding that the way you present yourself communicates something before you say a single word. I arrived at the courthouse with Leopoldo 20 minutes early. We sat in a small waiting room, and he briefly went over what he expected to happen. I listened to myself talk little and listen a lot, which was exactly what the situation required. Viviana arrived 7 minutes later with her lawyer. She came through the same door, and for a second our eyes met. It was just a second, but in that second I saw something on her face I hadn't seen before, in all the years I'd known her. It wasn't the calculated confidence of the woman who'd announced the divorce at Sunday dinner. It wasn't the anxiety of the following weeks. It was something deeper and harder to name. It was recognition, the recognition of someone who finally understands, with a clarity that can no longer be denied, that the person in front of her wasn't what she'd thought he was for all these years. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I looked away and didn't look at her again. The hearing lasted a little under 2 hours. The judge was a man in his 60s, methodical, with a way of speaking that was economical and precise, without unnecessary adornments. He reviewed the material with an attention I respected from the first moment. He asked specific questions, requested clarifications on 2 concrete points, and when he finished reviewing everything he had in front of him, he took a moment of silence before speaking. What he said in that hearing, I'm not going to reproduce word for word because it's not relevant in those technical terms. What matters is what it meant. The judge established that the evidence filed by the plaintiff, that is, by Leopoldo on my behalf, was solid and consistent enough to determine the framework of the process preliminarily. That the emotional abuse narrative presented by the defense was formally discredited based on the authenticated recordings, that the prenuptial agreement was valid and binding, and that the wealth structure we'd built, given it was documented with enough anticipation and clear legal legitimacy, couldn't be subject to retroactive challenge. In simple terms, and that's what I care to be understood, Viviana had arrived at that hearing believing she still had real chances, that her lawyer would find some angle, some crack, some argument that would give her background. She left that hearing knowing there was no angle, there was no crack, that the ground she thought she had never existed, because I'd made sure, with 3 years of silent and precise work, that it didn't exist. In the hallway, after the judge retired, Viviana's lawyer talked to Leopoldo for a few minutes in a low voice. I was a few meters away with my back turned, looking out a window at the parking lot. I didn't hear what they said, but I didn't need to hear it. When Leopoldo approached, his expression said it all. They want to negotiate, he told me in a low voice. Her lawyer says Viviana is willing to reach an out-of-court settlement. I looked at him. On what terms? That's what they want to discuss. But the fact they're proposing it now after this hearing means they know if this moves forward, the outcome will be considerably worse for her than any deal she can negotiate today. I took a few seconds. Tell them we already have the terms drafted, that we don't negotiate the core, only the timing. If she accepts them, we close. If she doesn't accept them, we move forward. Leopoldo nodded with that calmness of his and went back to Viviana's lawyer. The terms we'd prepared were the following. Viviana would receive a lump sum, $10,000, which Leopoldo had calculated as a figure that was significantly less than what she'd expected to get, but reasonable enough for her own lawyer to recommend she accept it against the alternative of continuing a process that was already clearly lost. The house stayed in the holding structure, out of the divorce equation. Viviana's personal accounts, the ones she'd managed during the marriage, were left to her with no claim on my part, no monthly alimony, no additional claims of any kind. Process closed. It wasn't generous. I didn't intend it to be. It was fair in the only sense that mattered. It was proportional to what Viviana had built with honesty during that marriage, which was considerably less than what she'd planned to claim. Her lawyer took the terms and asked for 24 hours to consult them with his client. Those 24 hours passed with a particular slowness. Not because I was anxious, that part was already behind me, but because there's something in the final weight of a long process that has its own texture, its own weight, like the last hours before dawn after a very long night. That night at the house, Viviana and I crossed paths in the kitchen for the first time in weeks without any urgent practical matter mediating. She was standing by the window with a cup of tea she didn't seem to be drinking. I went for water. I stopped for a moment before going back out. I don't know exactly what led me to say what I said. Maybe it was that the process was ending, and with it also ended the need to keep every word within a strategy. Maybe it was simply that there was something that needed to be said, and that was the only real moment left to say it. I don't hate you, Viviana. She looked at me. She didn't say anything for a moment. I know you don't, she finally said, and in her voice there was something I hadn't heard in years. Something that sounded like genuine exhaustion, like the exhaustion of someone who's carried too many lies for too long and no longer has energy to hold them up. Then why? I asked her, not with anger, just with the honest curiosity of someone who still doesn't fully understand that specific point. She took a while to answer, and when she did, it was with an honesty I didn't expect, and that somehow was the most painful thing of all that had happened in those years. Because it was easier than admitting I'd made a mistake from the beginning, and because you never complained, you never demanded anything. I assumed that meant it didn't matter. I kept looking at her for a moment. It always mattered, I told her. I simply learned not to expect it from you. I left the kitchen, went up the stairs, went into the guest room, and closed the door. The next morning, Leopoldo called me at 10. She accepted the terms. I breathed slowly. Good, proceed. And with those two words, 23 years formally reached their end. Not with a yell, not with a slammed door. With two words on a phone call on a Friday morning, while outside the sun came through the guest room window. And I thought that for the first time in a long time the day starting was completely mine. But there was still something left, something the legal process didn't resolve because it wasn't a legal matter. It was something more personal, more final, more necessary than any document signed before a judge. It was the last conversation that would forever change what each person in that story would understand about what had really happened. And that conversation was about to happen. We signed the final documents on a Tuesday morning with no ceremony, no drama, none of the elements movies associate with the end of a long marriage. Just two signatures in an office, a judge who validated the agreement, and a process that was closed with the same precision it had been built with. Leopoldo shook my hand outside the courthouse with a firmness that said more than any word. We said goodbye at the door. He went back to his office. I stayed a moment on the sidewalk with the morning sun on my face, breathing the air of a city that kept moving exactly the same as always, completely indifferent to what had just changed in my life. That indifference seemed perfect to me. I went back to the house for the last time that afternoon. Not to stay. I'd already arranged that in advance, like I'd arranged everything else. I had a small apartment in a quiet area, with a big window overlooking a park. I'd rented it 3 weeks before, furnished with the bare minimum, designed for a person starting from a clean slate. It wasn't a sacrifice, it was exactly what I wanted. I went to the house just to pick up what was mine, which turned out to be less than I would have imagined if someone had asked me years before. Some clothes, books, personal documents, a box with small things that had value to me and nobody else. Everything fit in the car's trunk. That told me something about what really matters when you remove all the accessories. Araceli was in the house when I arrived. She was waiting for me, I think. She was sitting on the stairs when I came in, with her hands together on her knees, with that expression of hers that always mixes more than it shows. She watched me go up the stairs, gather my things, come down again. She didn't say anything while I came and went. Only when I left the last box by the door did she get up and stand in front of me. "Can I hug you?" she asked. I didn't remember the last time any of my kids had asked me for a hug with those words, with that consideration, as if she understood it was no longer something she could take for granted, but something she had to ask for. I hugged her tightly for several seconds, with the honesty of someone who knows that moment won't be repeated the same way. She squeezed me with a strength I didn't expect from her, and when we pulled away, her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. She kept looking at me with that mix of hers of closeness and guilt I'd learned to read over time. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked me. "Yes," I told her, and it was true. It was the simplest and most complete truth I'd said in a long time. "Can I look for you after all this?" I looked at her for a moment. It was a fair question, a question that deserved an honest answer, not a comfortable answer. "You can look for me," I told her, "but I need you to understand something. I'm not going to be what I was. Not because I don't love you. I love you. That doesn't change with a signed paper. But because what I was in this house was a version of me carrying too much that wasn't mine to carry. That version no longer exists. If you look for me, you'll find me. But I'm going to be a different person, one who already learned where his limits are." She nodded slowly, and in that nod, I saw something that seemed important to me. Not relief, but respect. The respect of someone who understands what she hears is true, even if it's not what she wanted to hear. I took the last box, walked out the door, didn't look back. What happened next with each of them I didn't experience in the front row. It wasn't my front row anymore, but I knew it over time, the way you know things that happen on the margins of a life that already took another direction. Viviana received the $10,000 from the settlement. The first few months, she spent them with a speed anyone who knew her could have predicted. Beatriz included, although by then Beatriz had already stopped being the support Viviana thought she had. The distance Beatriz had started putting during the process became permanent when the legal implications of the recordings became clear. There were no formal criminal consequences for Beatriz. Leopoldo and I had decided from the start that our goal was to protect me, not destroy anyone. But the knowledge that those recordings existed and were in the hands of someone who could use them was enough for Beatriz to choose distance as her best option. Viviana lost her accomplice right when she needed her most. That was consequence enough. Without the monthly alimony she'd planned for, without the wealth she'd expected, and without the support network she thought she had, Viviana had to completely reorganize a life she'd built on the assumption that someone else would always carry the weight. That's not a punishment I imposed on her. It's the natural consequence of building your existence on a lie for 23 years and betting nobody would ever discover it. Marco took several months to process what had happened. The arrogance that had characterized him his entire adult life found a concrete limit when he understood the wealth he'd assumed as part of his future wasn't going to be available the way he'd calculated. That forced him to something that was probably the healthiest thing that could have happened to him. Although at the time he didn't experience it that way, to depend on himself, to build from what he was capable of generating, not from what he expected to inherit. I don't know if he became a better person. It's not my story to know, but I know circumstances put him in front of a reality he couldn't ignore, and that's usually the first step toward any real change. Andrea looked for me once, like she'd told me she would. It was a brief, uncomfortable conversation, with long silences neither of us knew well how to fill. She apologized. Not for everything. I think she still hadn't processed the whole thing, but for that specific night, for having smiled at the table when her mother announced the divorce. I told her I understood, and it was true. I understood her. She'd grown up in an environment where that was the dynamic she'd been taught, where my position in the family had been defined by others in a way she'd simply adopted without questioning it. The responsibility for that wasn't entirely hers, but it wasn't entirely mine to carry for the rest of my life either. We said goodbye with an honesty that was cordial, though it wasn't warm. And that was fine. Not everything has to end in reconciliation to end in peace. The new apartment had, like I said, a big window overlooking the park. I got used to drinking my morning coffee, sitting in front of that window, watching people pass by, dogs, kids, older people on their morning walks. That small and completely ordinary routine became something I didn't know I'd needed for years. Silence without tension, tranquility without the burden of what isn't said. I went back to working on consulting projects I'd left pending. Money wasn't the problem. The structure we'd built with Leopoldo left me in a solid position, not flashy, but completely stable. I worked because I liked it, because it kept me focused, because building things was always the way I understood my place in the world. Leopoldo called me a month after everything closed. Not about legal matters, that was already completely resolved. He called me simply to know how I was doing, which, coming from him, was in itself a way of saying what we'd done together had been more than a job. "How are you, Miguel?" he asked me. "Good." I told him, genuinely good. There was a brief pause. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, and hung up. That was one of the shortest and most complete conversations I had in that whole period. There's something people usually ask when they hear a story like this. Something that almost always appears, formulated in different ways, but with the same question underneath. Was it worth it? 3 years of silence, of observing, of building in the shadows while life went on above you. Was it all worth it? My answer is always the same. It wasn't about whether it was worth it. It was about doing the right thing the right way. I could have exploded that night in the hallway when I heard Viviana talking softly about documents and about how I'd never know anything. I could have confronted, yelled, destroyed everything in a moment of anger that would have been completely understandable, but that would have left me with nothing but the anger itself. I chose not to do it. I chose to build instead of destroy. I chose precision over impulse. And that choice was the difference between getting out of that situation with everything that was mine intact, not just the money, but the dignity, the clarity, the peace, or getting out empty-handed and brokenhearted. I'm not the biological father of any of those 3 kids. That's a fact that doesn't change. But I was their father for 24 years the only way I understand fatherhood, with presence, with work, with choices renewed every morning. Not what blood dictates, but what will build. And when that will found that the ground it had been building on was completely dishonest, I made the only decision that allowed me to remain who I was. I left with everything that was mine and with nothing that wasn't. Sitting in front of that window, overlooking the park, with morning coffee and the sun coming in slowly, I sometimes think about that Sunday table, the white tablecloth, the ceramic plates, the silence my words left before anyone breathed again. And I don't feel anger. I don't feel nostalgia either. I feel something it took me a while to identify correctly, but that I now recognize without a doubt. I feel I'm finally in the right place, living the right life without carrying what was never mine to carry, without holding up what chose not to hold itself up. Free, completely free. And now I ask you, who listened to all this to the end, if you'd been in my place with all the evidence in hand and 3 years of silence on you, would you have done the same? Or do you think there's a limit to how far the obligation goes for someone who chose to love a family that was never completely his?